Welcome, everybody. I'm Jason Nazar, and I am very happy to be joined today by Noam Bardin, the co-founder and CEO of Waze. This is our first of a series on entrepreneur going over If I Knew Then. So leadership lessons from amazing leaders like Noam talking about their journeys. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Comparably, an online employee review platform. I'm also a serial entrepreneur. I've started and sold a couple different companies, and here in Southern California, a pretty active investor, angel investor, board member. And one of the companies that I've always looked up to and just been absolutely amazed by is Waze, and how they grew from an auspicious startup in Israel into this really global phenomenon. So Noam, thank you so much for your time today. And in your own words, I'd love if you could just give everybody an overview of how you talk about Waze today.
So it's interesting. At Waze, we've been talking about it today as we did 11 years ago. Our mission has been around fighting traffic and really helping users find a better way to work. And our goal is to maximize whatever infrastructure we have. So people know us as this little app that helps you when you're driving, but behind the app is a whole community of users who build and maintain our maps and our traffic information. We have users that report information, incidents as they happen. We have partners that connect to us from cities and broadcasters. And this whole kind of network of activity is really around giving you the best route at that moment. We started out by outsmarting traffic together, basically trying to find shortcuts where we could find a better way of utilizing the roads, and kind of reaching a point where the roads are all utilized. And so we're moving into the world of carpooling, which is about taking cars off the road. So if both of us are driving to the same destination, the same time, the same day, if we can just match up together, one of us can leave our car at home. And that's kind of the extension of our activities, but it's all around the same mission. How do we fight traffic, which really is the ill of modern society?
Yeah. All right, so we're going to do this in three parts today. The first thing I want to do is get a state of affairs on where Waze is today. And I know where the business was a couple months ago is very different than today in July 2020, dealing with COVID. Would love to hear about your own journey, where you started your career, how you got to where you are today, the hard-won lessons that you had to learn, and the lessons that the company learned the hard way, and to pass those on to everybody. And then the third part will really look forward and say, okay, well, what's happening in the transportation industry? What's happening in technology? What's happening with distributed work? What was the company focused on, and how was it doing in February? And what are you focused on, and how are you doing today in July?
So, we started 2020 at kind of all systems go, right? We were at about close to 140 million active users, doing about 37 billion kilometers, close to 900,000 carpools a month. I mean, our products were coming together on the carpool side, which was new. Our core product was really going well. And then COVID hit. And obviously COVID impacted everyone. We're a little unique in the tech space that we're a driving app. And so when people are at home, yes, they'll watch more video, they'll do a lot of things online more, but they're not going to drive more. And we saw our usage literally drop off a cliff, right? So we dropped on average around 60%. But if you look at, say, Italy dropped 95%. New York dropped 90%, right? So we had this dramatic drop in our usage across everything that we do. And over the last 2 months in countries that have been opening up, we do see a return of traffic or an increase in traffic. Some countries are even close to where they were in February, but the profile of the drivers has changed. If in the past it was mostly driving home and work, today we're seeing a lot more of casual drives, errands, long distance drives, but much, much less commuting. And so if driving in the US is back to, let's say, 75, 80% of where it was before, commuting is only up like 45% compared to where it was before. So you can see that kind of the differences, and we're still kind of waiting to see how the world plays out.
Yeah. I've been really fascinated to see everything you're doing with your focus on carpooling. And I know that, you've been pretty vocal that autonomous vehicles and level 5 autonomous vehicles isn't going to be here as soon as we all think. I've had the same opinion, whether it's city or state regulations that are going to slow it down. How do you see the importance of carpooling, and also how is it different than traditional ride sharing from Uber or Lyft?
So around autonomous cars, I'm a strong believer that 50 years from now, no one will be driving. Driving will be a thing of the past. It'll be like cigarettes. I mean, the whole cities are going to change. This beautiful utopia is going to happen. At the same time, it's going to take a long time, has taken a long time, and will take longer. But I think we have to understand this is the biggest engineering challenge of our generation. That's how I look at it. This is equivalent to going to the moon or going to, or the atom bomb or building the internet. And it's being funded by private companies, unlike the other large endeavors, which is interesting. But more than that, the question we say autonomy, there's having the car be more autonomous, which many cars today are more autonomous than they were in the past. And there is level 5 autonomy where your car drives itself without a human inside it and parks itself. And that's when I talk about autonomy, that's what we're talking about. And the problem with that is that it's all or nothing. You can't be 99% accurate. You have to be 100% there. And that is very different than most software systems, but it also means that the challenge is very, very dramatic. To get to 85% self-driving is one challenge. To get to 100% something else. And so when we think about this challenge, which is being worked on and will happen, there are different stages to the challenges. The first challenge is really getting the technology to work. And that's obviously a huge challenge. But when it does work, we have the challenge of regulation. And the regulation is going to be different per state, per city, per highway, per weather, all these different constraints we're going to have. Once we finish that, we've got a problem with production, right? The total capacity of car manufacturing today is like 75 million cars a year, 80 million cars a year. There are 2 billion cars out there, right? So there's a huge issue of production capacity, not even talking about batteries, which are another huge constraint. But once we've solved that, we have a problem with the business model. And the business model of self-driving cars is similar to airlines more than anything else. Huge CapEx investments, huge OpEx investment, very, very competitive, and very little differentiation between the players. And so there isn't that margin that you would have in some sort of more software businesses. The margins are very, very thin. And the problem autonomous cars are going to have is that their competition is a ride-sharing network, for example, with humans, right? Car costs $16,000. A human driver can cost $20,000 to $30,000 to $40,000 a year. I mean, that's difficult to compete with because from the consumer perspective, a human doesn't drive worse than a computer. As a nation, as a people, it does. And we should all invest in autonomy. And that's why I see autonomy actually closer to a utility than to a competitive product. Much closer to electricity or water or things like that than a large margin business. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But regardless of how it plays out and which technology reaches the end and what's the business model, if we can't get multiple people into each car, we're basically back to square one. So if you have 1,000 cars driving the road today in any given segment, it doesn't matter if they're being driven by a human, by a computer, by a ride-sharing driver. If there's one person in the car and the rest of the seats are empty, traffic's only going to get worse, right? We're going to get more and more and more traffic as people are willing to sit and play with their phones while their car drives themselves. And so this issue of getting multiple people in the car really is carpooling, right? That's the basic issue. And it's an issue we can start today. We don't need to wait X years until we solve the engineering problems, because getting multiple people in the car is much more than an engineering problem. It's a social problem. It's a community problem. It's a problem of people getting along. And this kind of community challenge are the kinds of things that Waze is really good at. And this is what we're focusing on. So by the time autonomous cars come out, we want to be the company that really knows how to get multiple people into each one of them so we can reach that beautiful vision of the future where there are very few cars driving everyone around.
I think that's such a thoughtful perspective. I absolutely, buy the thesis that we need multiple bodies in a car to reduce traffic. I grew up in LA my whole life. And I have to say, one of the side benefits of COVID is this is the first time you can get to any part of town at any time, no traffic. The thing that I think about from the consumer's perspective is, what's the consumer's benefit today of carpooling versus ride sharing? Is it lower cost? Is it a different experience? How do you pitch that to the consumer today?
So it's kind of all of the above. So the real cost of car ownership and driving a car is actually very expensive, right? This is the second biggest expense we have after our homes. And we don't really think about it because we think of it as a sunk cost. I bought the car, but you're paying for insurance and for gas and for parking and all these kinds of things. So one aspect of carpooling is cost. Let's just share that cost between multiple people. Second aspect of carpooling is driving on HOV lanes. The cities are trying to constrain single occupancy vehicles. So whether it's HOV lanes or congestion pricing, all the different tools that are trying to nudge people into the direction of find smarter ways to drive. So if you can get the HOV lane, it can save you 20 minutes on your commute. That's probably worth a lot more than the money for some people, right? So that's the second big benefit. Third benefit is actually that social interaction. It's the biggest challenge on the one hand, but it's also the biggest advantage. What we see happening, it's really hard to get people to take their first carpool. Everyone has their fears and everyone's parents told them never get into a car with a stranger, et cetera, et cetera. But once they do it, people really get hooked on it. And it begins becoming more of a social phenomenon in addition to a means of transportation. You suddenly get to know your neighbors, right? If you think about commuting, these are people that live next to you and work next to you, that the people you're carpooling with, but you probably don't even know today. And they live really near you, right? So we're finding these amazing social connections happening, these personal connections between people helping each other out. And that's really the normal state of things, right? Humans for millions of years, we used to live in tribes and we know how to get along with each other. It's only lately that we've started not knowing our neighbors and locking our doors and being disconnected from the world. And carpooling gives you a little slice of being part of something. And so there's a big, I think, social impact that can happen out of carpooling as well. That being said, it's a very big challenge because there's a lot of friction. You're used to doing things a certain way. Suddenly to change the way you do things, all these fears, it's a change of behavior. And as anyone in the consumer tech space knows, change of behavior is extremely difficult to do.
Yeah. And it sounds like some of the main benefits of using, Waze carpooling versus like an Uber pool would be that it's a bit more communal. It sounds like it could be even more cost efficient because I'm not sure you all are taking a percentage of the rides yet. Is there anything else that you feel like is fundamentally different from, Lyft?
So ride sharing fundamentally is a taxi service with really good interfaces. Right. And it's phenomenal what ride sharing has done. And also ride sharing has convinced us to get into strangers' cars. So that I'm all for it, ride sharing. But ride sharing really works on short distances. If you have to go from San Francisco to Mountain View and you're going to take an Uber or a Lyft or a ride sharing service, it's going to cost you $30, $40, $50. This is not something you can do every day to commute. And this is why we're very focused on the commuting aspect of carpooling and on long distance commuting. We're not about how do I travel within New York City or within San Francisco, or within Mountain View. We're about how do you get from New Jersey to New York every day? How do you get from Long Island into New York? How do you get from Mountain View to San Francisco? Those long commutes of 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers are really where we're focused. And that's where the cost benefit is dramatic. So we'll be about a quarter of the cost of ride sharing, and it could be much less. In addition, that's where the HOV lanes matter and where we can save you time as well. And that's where most of the traffic is. And so we can actually help the environment, ourselves, et cetera, by doing this. So that's where we differentiate from ride sharing from a functional perspective. The flip side is ride sharing is professional or semi-professional people who this is their job. And because it's their job, you can, on the one hand, enforce different things. But on the other hand, there's a certain payment you have to make and a certain activity. Carpooling is volunteers, people that are driving anyway, right? If I'm driving from San Francisco to Mountain View anyway, and I've got 3 or 4 empty seats in my car, to add 1 or 2 people in there is a very different experience. I'm not a ride-sharing driver, right? That's not who I am. I'm going to work with Google or wherever I'm going to work, but I'm part of something bigger, and I get to meet these people, and I get to save some money, and I get to drive in the HOV lane. I get all these different benefits, but it's volunteers, and that means we have less control over what they do, which creates a product challenge. But at the same time, it also means that you get to know your driver. And these small networks occur of like 4 or 5 people that live in a similar place, work in the same place, and they get to know each other. And as they know each other, they trust each other more. They look out for each other. They take care of each other. And all these like phenomenal things that communities do kind of begin emerging from these small networks.
All right, I want to look backwards a little bit. And part of what I want to dive into for a moment is one of the most amazing challenges that I think Waze figured out, which actually isn't a technical challenge. So, I've started now 2 user-generated content businesses that are that are like marketplaces, right? Comparably relies on people putting in their own salaries and rating and reviewing their employers. DocStock before this was a site where people could find and share any document, so it relied on user-generated documents. To me, what I think people don't give Waze enough credit for, and why I'm so amazed that you pulled it off as an independent startup, is that you all had to solve for real-time liquidity of supply and demand. It's not like a marketplace where someone can upload products and goods and someone can check it a month later and those products and goods are there. You had to have people actively driving on roads, seeing the amount of traffic, and have enough of that activity paired with enough demand of people looking. And then you had to do it in micro locations and multiply that times a million. Whenever somebody pitches me a marketplace business, you know, and it has real-time liquidity needs, I always get so, you know, cautious and skeptical. So I'm like, you have no idea how hard that's to pull off. How the hell did you all do this all those years ago? How did you get so much liquidity of supply and demand in real time like that?
So now I'm supposed to say that we were all geniuses, etc. But the reality is it's tremendous luck and time. And so when we started Waze, it was a very different world. There were two map companies in the world. There was Navtech and there was TeleAtlas. And Navtech had just been bought by Nokia for $8 billion. And TeleAtlas was bought by TomTom for $4.5 billion. And those were the only maps. There was no Google Maps. There was no Apple Maps. There was nothing. That was it. And navigation apps used to cost about $10 a month on your cell phone, on your, I'm trying to think of polite word, you're not very good old cell phone. And that was the world where we started building maps with communities, with people. And we had to build our own map. And the most expensive part of a navigation product then was the license to the map, because it was duopoly. And this created an opportunity for us to come in with a map that in the beginning would be lower quality and would improve over time in terms of the quality that it created. And it was before the iPhone. The iPhone had just come out when we started, right? There were a lot of pieces that were missing from the ecosystem itself. I think the things that we were most surprised on was really the commitment or the participation that people are willing to do. And what I've kind of learned from that is that overall people want to do the right thing. And that's a big statement, because we always kind of imagine that people are all serial killers out there to murder everyone. And that's not the case. People want to do the right thing, but people are lazy. And so you've got to find the balance. How do you give people the option to do the right thing with minimum friction and minimum cost on their side? And this is really sort of how we began building Waze. We began with gamification, giving people all kinds of virtual goods about using the app when we could not get you where you were going, right? The app was terrible, right? Our map was terrible. But the mission was clear to people. And they knew what would happen, and they could imagine what would happen if everyone did this. And with that, making it frictionless, making it fun. You know, fun is the word that professional world we kind of decide not to talk about, right? We're all very serious. People like to have fun. If you bring a smile to someone's face, they're going to do it again, especially when it's something as boring as commuting and sitting in traffic all day. And so between these things, we got people to participate enough. Some hardcore, which are our core community that builds the map. Some participate about 12% of our users actually report incidents that they see. And then most users just use it, but as they're using the app, we're actually sampling the GPS chip. So they're actually contributing passive data back in. And so between all of these different things, we managed to build a system that would improve. And a lot of times people talk about MVPs as being a very narrow and wide system, right? So you only have one level of the stack built. We went the other way. We went vertical, but narrow, meaning we had the whole stack built: traffic, reporting, incidents, maps, etc., with very terrible service. But it means if you were the first user to use a service somewhere and you drove slowly on a road, you created traffic on it. And you could see it, so you could understand what would happen when it went there. One of the first experiences we focused on, one of these aha moments, was when you saw someone else driving on the map. And so we engineered for that experience. We played with the zoom levels of the app and the direction of the app so that you would have a high probability of seeing someone. Because immediately when you saw someone, it was like, wow, Today you open up Waze, there are all these Wazers, people like to complain about them. But at the time, there was no one. It was empty. And suddenly you saw another Wazer. Another thing we did was we would show you incidents around the closest incidents around you when you stopped at a stop sign. And I remember this email from this user really pissed off. They were in Mountain View and they were seeing incidents in New York. And they're like, why are you showing me this? This is just silly, etc. But the message was someone else is using the app. You're not alone. And as you used it more, it started in New York, and then it became California, and then it became Mountain View, and then it became the road in front of you, right? As more people began joining the network. But giving people the full experience so they can see what will happen, it really gives them that feeling of the mission that they're on and why this is worth doing versus doing something that's very, very scaled down experience, but very, very wide in terms of that it works everywhere.
Yeah. One of the traps I think a lot of entrepreneurs fall into is this, quote of like, if you build it, they will come. And, I often say it's not the best products that win in the short term. The best products win in the long term if they can stay alive. In the short term, it's the best marketed products that then can become the best products. And so when you look back on that first year, how did you get those early, active, intense, contributors? How did you get those first 1,000 people that would do all that work to build the maps to start off with? It must have been a little more than they just wanted to give back.
So we actually don't know. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time trying to analyze. Obviously, if we can build a clear model, then we can scale it, do other things. And there is this kind of magical thing about early adopters, right? How do you find them? How do they find you? How do they get involved in the product? And this was a combination of PR and media and just like hard work, hand-holding each one. But I think the bigger challenge, though, getting early adopters is hard but achievable. Crossing the chasm is really where things get much more complicated to the early majority. And it really becomes a challenge as a product designer or someone building product, right? Who do you listen to for feedback? The early adopters are going to be very active and very passionate, but the feature set they're going to be interested in is probably not what the early majority is interested in. And you need to make them happy because they're building your product. But at the same time, you don't want to build a product that's right for 3% of the population. So it's very, very hard to find that balance. And I think for us, what helped us in this process was having a clear mission at every stage and clarity about where we were at every stage. So to me, clarity means being able to write something. Until you write something, it didn't exist, right? In your head, you can hold all kinds of crazy ideas, but once you write them down, they become real, and you really understand the challenges. So at every stage, we kind of had a clear definition of where we're at, what we're trying to achieve. Stage one, we're about early adopters, we're trying to find these early adopters. We invested heavily in making the app fun and engaging, in tools for editing and things like that. Second stage, we began looking for more sort of regular users. And so we had to scale back some of the fun stuff that we were doing. The power users definitely did not like that. We had to scale back some of that stuff because it wasn't right for an early majority user. And so keeping that clarity at every stage, it really allowed us to evolve the app as we went through these different stages of growth.
All right, well, talking about early adopters, let's go back to your early life. So one of the things that's always fascinating to me is look at people that have had, this incredible success like you and your team. And, what was your origin story? What was your childhood like in the sense of like, did you see yourself as an entrepreneur? Did you want to create this big life and success? What were the motivating factors for you as you thought, early on in life, as you thought about where you wanted to be?
So I definitely never imagined myself in tech in general. My father was an engineer at the Hebrew University. I grew up in Israel. My father was an engineer at the Hebrew University. And so whenever we'd hang out in his lab at the time, this is the days of mainframes, Macs had come out. And my brother, who ended up going into engineering, et cetera, and is actually a VP at Google as well, my brother would be building software, coding things with my father, being excited. I was the one outside climbing the tree. Like, I didn't want anything to do with this. And I studied in my undergrad economics and political science, where I was going to go to Africa and save the world. That was the plan. And then during that, my undergrad, I, by a series of coincidences, ended up meeting some people who had founded a startup and we're looking for someone to do, someone who spoke Hebrew actually was the big requirement. And so I got exposed to this world of startups through that. And at the time, we're talking about mid-90s, startups weren't defined as they are today. It wasn't an industry. Venture capital wasn't as defined. I mean, so many of things were different at the time. And so it really was a different world that I got into than what you would have today. And I mean, the internet was just getting started. And when the internet was getting started, nobody knew what was going on. So anybody who had a slight idea, mattered and counted. And so coming in the 90s was very, very different than coming in today, where the industry is established, kind of protocols and operations are established. We had to build data centers. We had to build the computers themselves and install the software on them and the cloud. So many things have changed. But I think at the same time, what stayed the same throughout this whole time really is, the focus on kind of the mission and the strategy of what you're building. And so I ended up in the late 90s founding a company together with some co-founders called Delta 3, which was one of the first voice over IP providers. And that I rode that through the first bubble, as we call it. And I was one of those believers who really thought that eyeballs mattered and the world was changed. There's a new economy. It's all going to be different now. And of course, reality smacked us in the face. We still managed to keep the company going, and the company, I think, is still alive. After that, I decided now I'm really going back to save the world, and I did a master's in public policy, went back to Israel. I was living in New York at the time, went back to Israel and joined some nonprofits, different things like that. And one of the things we forget when we're in tech is the quality of the people we're around every day. The person in the office that everybody hates, that idiot that everybody complains about, that ruins everything for everyone, probably has a PhD in math, right? It's like the level of people we're around is so different. When you go to government, you go to other industries, you suddenly realize how stupid people can be. It's like you didn't think that's possible, and it is. So that was kind of a shock for me. And after like a year and a half there, I decided it's not for me. Came back to tech, took over a job as CEO of a small startup that was trying to do content delivery. And I took the job for all the wrong reasons. And it was a terrible mistake. It was the 2 worst years of my life. It was really just horrible. And the reason was I joined a company for the wrong reasons. And this is, I think, the most important lesson there is really to be clear about why you're joining a company, why this company specifically. Because the amount of work you do on a failed company is the same as a successful company. The only difference is obviously your state of mind and the outcome, but the work is the same. And I ended up actually shutting down that company, and it was terrible experience, really terrible experience. I learned probably the most I've learned from anywhere from that, looking back. And more than anything,
what were the big things you learned?
So a lot had to do really with focus and strategy. It had to do with moving parts and control. This company was trying to change multiple parts of the technology stack and the consumer experience and the internet infrastructure and all these things together. And what I walked away was with the importance as a startup of owning your destiny. You cannot be dependent on partners. You cannot be dependent on infrastructure changes, anything. You need to control your destiny completely. And that has to be a key part of how you go forward. Once you're successful, it's very easy to bring on partners. But if you're dependent on partners to get started, you're never getting out there. You're constantly a vendor. You're not really a product company. And on top of that, the reason I wanted to join this company was for personal reasons, again, the wrong reasons. But the best thing was that the person that ran engineering for me at that company was a very good friend of one of the founders of Waze. And through that, I met the founders and we ended up joining Waze. And so there is, positivity in that period of time.
Yeah. I think to me, that's also one of the things that's so fascinating is that there are a lot of folks that sometimes will sit on the sidelines of entrepreneurship saying, oh, I need a better idea. I can't take risk right now. I think just putting yourself in the game, you make these connections and you never know where something's going to take you. I know you said Delta 3 is maybe even still around today, but that first company you were part of, if you could go back in time and give your own self advice to try to make that a more successful outcome, what lessons would you share with yourself around that business?
So I think that one of the core lessons that I think I walked away with is really that clarity of mission. And clarity of mission means a lot of different things, right? It means knowing why you want to do this specifically, right? And a lot of people end up doing things because they think it's going to sell, or it's going to be a good deal, or they think it's good investors. It's like when a recruiter calls you up and says, I have this hot company you should join. It's got this or this or this investors, right? That's not a reason to join a company. Right? And the fact that these investors are in doesn't mean that anything about the company. Really having that clarity about what your personal interest is. Now, today startups are 10, 15-year journeys, right? They're not that different from traditional companies in terms of the amount of time. So you need to join something where you are interested enough in what you're doing to go the distance. On top of that, startups, risk adjusted, are the worst career choices you can make. Right? You go to a large company, Google, Facebook, etc. You go as an engineer there, keep your head down, go up through the ranks. You will make more money, risk adjusted, than the average startup founder, right? And so it's not really about money. And this is what people are mistaken. Most startups don't make it. So you have to love what you're doing enough that it's worth doing, even if you fail at it. And this is what mistakes I made of not choosing the right space to go into, or the right mission to be on. And on top of that, once you start, you can't stop. You've taken money from people. You have these commitments. You have employees, etc. This is it. You're going to be doing this for the next 10 years. So make sure that you really know what you want to do and love it. The second of it, in terms of clarity of mission, is for the company to know what it's trying to do and why, and understand what stage it's in. And this is one of the mistakes that I made, of having kind of a fuzzy idea of what I want to do. And fuzzy doesn't work in real life. It works well in your head. In your head, you can hold all these fuzzy ideas, but in real life, you need that clarity, because that clarity allows you to say no to 95% of the things. And when you're not successful in a company, you're kind of on your own in a room in the dark, kind of pretty sad. But when you are successful, you're being bombarded with opportunities, and your challenge is to say no to 90+% of these opportunities. They all make sense, right? It's not that you have a smart idea and a stupid idea. You've got two smart ideas driven by smart people that both make sense. How do you choose which idea to go on? And it's very easy to get pulled in other directions, which are counter to your mission, if you don't have clarity of your mission. And so that's been, I think, a really important thing that I learned, and that at Waze we've been very focused on, is to be very clear about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what stage are we in when we're doing it, right? And what we're trying to achieve at this stage. Now that changes every time. Your stages change as the company grows. But if you don't know, if you try to run too fast, if you think you have product market fit when you don't, you're going to burn out all your money. If you don't understand that you have product market fit and are running faster, you're going to miss the opportunity. So all these different opportunities and options exist, but clarity of mission really helps you as a North Star of what to say yes and what to say no to. And really helps you also navigate that gap between what you're doing today and where you want to be 10 years from now, which I think is one of the biggest challenges founders have, right? You go to raise money, you got to sell a big story. You want to do it. You got to really believe you're changing the world, but tomorrow you need to commit these 3 lines of code, and that feature has to ship. And that's a very difficult gap to manage between the 20,000 foot and the 3 feet of reality.
Yeah. So I'd actually love to dive into that for a moment and maybe pull out some more of your specific advice around how you communicate that to your team. That's something that I've tried to adhere to for a long time. It's something I try to coach companies that I invest in, is just staying maniacally focused. I think in startups, the Pareto principle is not that 20% of what you do leads to 80% of your success. It's that one thing you do and do really well leads to 99% of your success. I think one of the areas that I've struggled with over the years is I often feel like I'm telling my team no too much. And it can either come off as being a micromanager, or that it can be capricious just based upon my whims, and that I probably haven't maybe documented or made the mission clear enough and then recommunicated that. When you have someone on your team come to you pitching an idea and you have got to make that call to say no, how do you communicate that to the individual, and how do you communicate to the org of why you're saying no to certain things, and do it in a way that doesn't, like, how do you make it so that they don't want to then not come back with another idea because they're like, oh, well, that Jason or that Noam was always just going to put my idea down and do whatever they think they should do anyway?
So this goes back to me to the clarity of mission. When your mission is clearly defined, and in terms of what you're trying to achieve and what stage you're in right now that gets you to where you want to go, it becomes a tool for saying no, right? When someone comes to the idea, you can throw it up against your mission and against the stage you're in. We're at the beginning of the company now, let's say the beginning of Waze, right? Our number one goal was to get people to be driving and contributing data. Every idea that came along, does that help us get more people driving? Well, no, this is once they drive, they can do this. Well, that doesn't help us. We wanted to start driving. So that's immediately a no. And this is the tool that you have for saying no. And by the way, I don't believe there's ever too much saying no. The biggest risk is what you say yes to, not what you say no to. What you say no is probably fine. But more than that, than saying no, it's also where do you not give up? It's very easy to give up on things. It's hard. It's not working. Let's pivot. Pivot is the word I hate the most. I think there's the whole idea of failing and like idealizing failure, which the Silicon Valley has done, is I think one of the biggest mistakes that Silicon Valley has done. Failing is part of the process, but we should agonize over every failure. We burnt someone else's money. Some retired person is not going to have as much in their paycheck because we decided to go down the wrong path. We should agonize over it. We should still take risks, but we should agonize over the failure, not idealize it. But the same thing in terms of the clarity of mission there. If something failed, but it's crucial to your mission, you keep trying at it. It doesn't mean that you pivot somewhere. So you gotta keep cracking it in a different direction. If something fails that's not core to your mission, then fine, you shouldn't be doing it anyway. And that really becomes that tool for making the priority decisions.
Yeah. So maybe along that, I know we talked about a couple of lessons you've learned along the way. One that you referenced to me was, loyalty with your team versus scaling in the needs. Can you talk about, what you feel like you know today and what you would have done differently maybe 5 or 10 years ago because of that?
So I think this is one, I've made a lot of mistakes, and luckily there are a lot of more mistakes to make. So we can keep making new mistakes every day. We don't have to make the same mistake again and again and again. But a mistake that I've made multiple times, and I still don't believe I know logically the answer, but I don't kind of feel it. When you start out in a company, you're starting out a team of people who are committed to each other, and especially committing to the founders and to the leaders of the company. And you're all in this together, fighting the world, right? And as the company grows, those people who helped build the company, who did everything right, who were crucial to getting you to where you are, the company's going to begin outgrowing them. Some people can grow with the company, and they keep growing with it, et cetera, and great example. Well, I won't get into examples, but you can think a lot of founder CEOs who've gone with the company wherever they've gone. But there are a lot of people that just can't. They're really good at a 20-person stage, but they're not good at the 150-person stage. And they can't make that leap, and you need to be able to say goodbye to them. And you have to do this respectfully, and they're friends of yours, et cetera. But they're never going to understand why. Because no one sees themselves as not scaling, right? And no one understands that they're the wrong person. And this I found the hardest thing. But at the same time, that's what's going to kill the company if you don't make the change. Because what you need, the type of company you need for 20 people or 100 people, you need very different people for running a company at a very, very different scale. And startup founders like to talk about how fast they move and how quick their company is. And that's fine at a certain stage. At a different stage, you need to worry about stability, and you need to worry about onboarding engineers. And you need to worry about how quickly can an onboarded engineer ramp up. Not how elegant your technical solution was, and there are 3 people in the world that can understand it. And if you haven't hired them, you can't hire any more engineers because they're the only ones that can understand it, right? It doesn't matter if it's elegant. It matters if it's scalable. If multiple people can work at it at the same time. So these kind of challenges mean you have to go through this terrible process of saying goodbye to people who helped build the company. And you have to be aware of this, and there's kind of no choice but to do it, because if you don't, you're going to run into the wall of your culture / capabilities / systems. Everything is connected to people, right? So you're going to end up trying to, run a large corporation on the infrastructure of a 20-person startup, and that just never works. So you're going to end up dying anyway, and it's very painful and it's very difficult. And I don't think I have the right answers to how to do it, but at the same time, you have to do it. And I think that Blitzscale, the book Blitzscale talks really well about those stages, going from family to a tribe, to a town, to a city, to a country, as different, and each stage needs different people to be successful at that stage.
Yeah. So let's bring it back to you for a moment here. I've been on a lot of boards where we had discussions of whether that founder CEO was the right person to scale through. I'm sure, I've had board members myself that have questioned me on that. When you look over the last, 15 years of your career, what do you think helped you be successful at those early stages of, working with that family-like environment and getting early product market fit and still being really successful today at a company that's part of, one of the 5 largest organizations in the world?
That's a tough question, and I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but I think it does go back to clarity of mission. When you kind of believe in the mission that you're doing, it matters less who owns the equity of the company. And I remember when we had a very difficult time selling the company to Google internally. We had some of us wanted to sell, and some of us didn't want to sell. And it was a question of what we do. And I don't remember who it was who said, at the end of the day, do you care if your equity is Google or is VC XYZ? And that was something that was very important, I think, in our decision making. And a lot of companies today, when they acquire companies, leave them intact. And I think that's a new trend. I think, started with Instagram and other companies. I guess Audible also started way before. But being able to keep companies have a magical DNA about them. And that's something that doesn't just integrate after an acquisition. I'm not sure what it is about kind of the culture that we built, but I think at the end of the day, the type of people that you want in your company are people that are looking for transparency. They want to understand what you say. They don't want to feel that you're saying something, that you're taking them for a ride. And that honesty and transparency, being able to say the reality as it is I think one of the differences between a startup and a corporation, right? And the more startups become closer to corporations, the less transparent they become, the less honest they become to each other, and things fall apart. And so that would be one, I think, clear thing. People sniff out bullshit always. People always understand bullshit. So it's like you can't pretend. You have to be real, and you have to be yourself, and you have to be transparent and honest.
Yeah. All right, 2 more questions about you, and then I want to talk a little bit about, where you see the future of the industry and some other areas that you see forward looking. What's been the hardest part for you about transitioning from, running your own company in a startup to being part of a large organization? What are the skills you had to build? I can tell you very frankly, when I sold my last company when I was 35, I just wasn't ready to not be an entrepreneur yet. And so, Intuit bought my last company. They're an incredible organization. So much I learned from them. And honestly, a lot more I could have learned from them. But, I was in a mindset then that I just got to get right back in the game. And I don't think I took full advantage of all the things I could have learned in that situation, or even done as much as I could to help them once I was part of that company. What are the muscles and skill sets that you've had to build being part of Google, and what are the things that you've learned specifically in this chapter of your life professionally?
So I think everyone is surprised that I've stayed so long at Google. That's been the ongoing. Nobody believed that I would survive there for a year. Everyone was sure I would blow up and get fired or something. First of all, Google is a very unique place. I have to say that, there are not many companies, I don't think there are any companies like Google in many, many different ways. One of the things that they've done is allowed us to stay with our own culture, our own identity, our own tech stack, and basically given us the ability to be a small startup within a large company. And without that, I wouldn't be here, and I'm sure a lot of other people wouldn't. And that's been, I think, a crucial thing of being able to provide that balance between a small company, but yet we have constraints of a large company, and our legal policy, et cetera, externally we're viewed as Google. So our risks are not just I'm not just taking the risk, Google is taking the risk. But Google is a risk-taking company and allows us to really push the envelope a lot of things that we're doing. Google is a phenomenal place for innovation and really allows us to innovate and to try new things. And I think Google appreciates the brand that we've built. I mean, I think the thing I'm the most proud of at Waze is actually the brand. The fact that when you say Waze to almost anyone in the world, they have an opinion. They might hate you. They might love you. They might immediately say, well, why in the corner of 34th and 2nd you'd make a left and not a right, right? They always have something to say. And to me, that's the most important thing, right? People care about what we're doing in a very different way than they care about a lot of other software, right? They feel differently. They have an emotional connection to our software, and it's not just a utilitarian or a functional connection. And to me, that's what a great brand is. And Google understands that and allows us to continue to build our brand independently and to thrive within it. And I think it's less strange these days because if you look at Instagram, right, and if you look at in other companies that have managed to build, Uber just acquired Grubhub, right? We'll kind of see where that goes, right? But it's a good chance that brand will survive, right? Because there's something unique about brands and about identities and cultures that can't all get mashed up into one thing.
Yeah. All right. Last question for you before we go on. And I think you meant Postmates, right? Uber, Postmates.
Sorry, Postmates.
Yeah,
sorry.
Absolutely. I didn't want to.
That was last week.
You broke some new story.
Last week because Grubhub.
Yeah. Obviously, you've had a career that most of us wish we could have or will have. That said, if you could go back to yourself in your 20s or 30s, what's the big piece of advice that you'd give yourself in regards to your career?
In terms of sort of career planning, one of my problems, well, it was an advantage and a problem, is that I never really had a path that I thought of, I'm going to go this way. Things kind of happened and everything kind of led to other things. I think a lot of people today are really focused on where does this lead me? I see it all the time. Like, what's my career trajectory? You're 23. It's your first job. What do you mean career trajectory? Work-life balance. You're 23. You shouldn't have work-life balance. It's like there's something that's been lost in the culture of being hyper-competitive and trying to manage and plan every step. And life happens randomly. You meet people. You do things. You try things. You take risks. And I think that's the unique thing you have in your 20s. Your 20s are unique. Again, it depends if you're married and kids, etc. But I was not married with kids in my 20s. And being able to take jobs, change locations, try different things, not being too focused on where does this lead to, but rather, is this interesting for me now? Mm-hmm. And really being able to enjoy the moment and learn from the moment and work really hard in that moment instead of always thinking about where does career lead me. I know very few people who've planned a career and it worked out the way they planned it. And definitely not many successful people. So a little more focusing on the moment and a little less focusing on where I'm going to be 20 years from now, I think would be very powerful. I
love that. All right. Well, let's that said, talk about maybe 20 years from now, not our careers, but I'm here 2 blocks from the beach in Santa Monica. You can see that no one is here in our office. We're like everybody else, a work from home organization now for the first time. What's your take on this? Like, Twitter just announced that they are fine indefinitely having people work from home. I think companies like Google and Facebook will continue to be at the forefront of this, already saying, most large organizations that I know in the tech space have said nothing else for 2020 required in offices. What is the future of distributed work? Like, how do you see it? And how are companies going to have to manage through this all?
So I think what we're seeing is an acceleration of trends that have been going on, right? And a radical acceleration. And by some weird coincidence, I was in Kentucky last week. And in downtown a city in Kentucky, you can buy a building for $35,000, right? Think about San Francisco for a minute, right? You can buy a building there. And I think this issue of being distributed is crucial for people's quality of life and for how we evolve as a nation. Being able to take advantage of the fact that America is so big and there's so much land in America and there's so many different ways that people could live instead of all of us trying to live the same way. And so I think I have no idea, obviously, how things are going to play out. No one does. But I can guarantee they're not going to go back to where they were. I think that's the one thing that's clear. So I think we're going to have much more mixed work, meaning you go into the office a day or two a week. There are a lot of things you can only do physically in the room, right? Brainstorming over Zoom is really difficult. Building a connection over Zoom is very difficult. So there's definitely going to be a lot more of this. We're going to need physical meetings. That's not going to go away. We're humans. We live in tribes. But at the same time, you don't have to sit for 2 hours in traffic. You don't have to spend a fortune on real estate and on your apartment and on rentals. And so there are going to be a lot of changes in that direction. And I think the third thing, something we saw in the last 10 years, but now it's accelerating, is companies that are built, distributed from day one. And I'm seeing friends of mine that are starting new companies today, and they don't have an office. No one lives in the same city or same country in many cases. There is no physical server anyway. Everything is software mashed together, and 7 people can do what it would have taken 700 people to do 10 years ago, right? So there's a huge change of all these different things coming together between cloud computing and open source and all of these kind of services that you can mash up together, built on the cloud, and remote working and distributed work environments and the cost of real estate. I think is going to lead to a new type of company that's mostly distributed, meets from time to time, and we're seeing it today. Google, at Google's scale, is working from home. I mean, that's unthinkable when you think about having 100,000 plus people working from home.
Is that sustainable? I mean, if that was the case for another 2 years, would a company like Google be as productive, you think?
So I think it's two different things. The fact that we're working from home in a crisis situation is the biggest problem. So people have their kids at home, and people are in small apartments because they're used to, they wanted to live in San Francisco and they don't have enough space, and all those things. I think if we didn't have the pandemic, and we all were working from home, we could be much more effective and efficient than we were before. Because suddenly you could meet in the office twice a week, and you could come in only for specific meetings, but you could live a 2-hour drive, not 2-hour commute, a 2-hour drive in the city. Because twice a week you're coming in, right? And so it's worth it. Then traffic could drop dramatically if we were all coming in several days a week. And of course, we're carpooling into our work those several days. That would be even better, right? There are all these structural changes that can happen out of this. But I think that right now, working from home, which has been surprisingly efficient, by the way, really depends on what your role is. If you're an engineer versus a salesperson, you're having very different experiences. If you have kids or don't have kids, or if your kids are teenagers or 3, right? If you live in a city or live in a suburb, right? If your house is big and small. So people are going through very, very different experiences. But as we get to a more normal kind of work from home environment, we'll be able to match our lifestyles to take advantage of what working partially from home can bring.
Yeah. And one of the topic I want to just touch on is, you grew up in Israel, you spent some time in the Bay, you're in New York now. I've never, a lot of times people thought that companies that I started were based out of the Bay Area. I've always been here in Los Angeles. It's a lot different today than it was 10 years ago, where you see companies going public and being sold for billions of dollars all over the world. What was your experience living and working in the Bay, and maybe what you see as the value of not being in the Bay?
So it's funny. I left the Bay about 2 years ago after living almost 8 years in the Bay. Just because I was fed up with the whole kind of Bay environment. There is no diversity in the Bay. It doesn't matter where you came from, what color you are, whatever. You all have an undergrad in engineering. You're a PM at Facebook. You're just sold your company. All there is tech. And moving to New York, suddenly going to a dinner event and not knowing what anybody does. The Bay, you go in, you already know. You don't know the actual person, but you can see by the shoes and the jeans, kind of know what they're doing. So I think diversity is a crucial part of seeing the rest of the world. And I think if you grow up in the Bay, if you're living in the Bay, building products in the Bay, and getting all your feedback in the Bay, you end up building products for super smart, super rich people living in the Bay. And that's not the world. The world does not have an undergrad in engineering. Right? And so leaving the Bay brings a very important perspective on what real life is like. Not that New York is exactly real life, but closer to real life. Even just something like taking the subway, which of course we don't do now, but in the past I used to call the subway in New York as a big equalizer. Right? I love the fact that my kids now take the subway to school because you see all kinds of people. people with different smells, people that are having problems, people that look different. Like, all these different things happen when you have public transit. And, coming from Israel, we always had to be remote because Israel is a tiny market. There's no market in Israel. So you always had to be remote. Moving to the Bay accelerated Waze dramatically. Waze would not be Waze today if I hadn't moved to the Bay. The Bay is a special place. It's a unique place. It's a huge accelerator for startups. It is a difficult and very, very expensive place as well. Hiring talent is hard. Retaining talent is really hard. People run after the next shiny thing. There's a lack of loyalty to your company. And so I think finding that distributed balance, you have to be in the Bay as a startup. Again, depends what space your startup is, but many times you will raise more money. You will move faster. You'll have better board members. Like, everything's going to be better. At the same time, your engineers probably don't need to be in the Bay anymore. You should probably hire them somewhere else where they're going to be loyal to the company, where they're reasonable living costs, where they can afford to buy a house, et cetera. And we're a little too caught up with how good the engineers are in the Bay. They're great engineers everywhere in the world. And it's more a question of being able to bring the values and the pace of the Bay to other parts of the world. But, that being said, there is a lot of places like to say we're the next Silicon Valley. There is no next Silicon Valley. There's one Silicon Valley. And unless we have, another Google, Facebook, Apple, et cetera, all in one place else in the world, there isn't going to be another Silicon Valley.
All right. Well, last question I've got for you. I know you said you don't plan out your career, and that's kind of what made it special and unique. As far as you can tell today, what are the next 10 years look like for you? What are you focused on professionally? What do you care about? What do you want to create and do in the next chapter of your professional career?
So I'm still in a big chapter of my career. I think we've got two very, very, very large challenges as a species, right? One is really global warming, and which of course is a liberal conspiracy, but I personally believe in it. And the whole issue of climate change is a challenge that the governments are not going to be able to handle. It's up to us to take care of. And so that's one thing that I'm very interested in. The other really is the future of liberal democracies. What we've seen happening the last few years across the world. It's not just an American phenomenon. And we see how illiberal authoritarian leaders are trying to deal with coronavirus versus liberal democracies or efficient governments. And so the question of what does the government or the social structure of the future look like is something that keeps me up at night a lot. What does journalism look like? What does freedom of speech look like? What does civil rights look like? All these questions, I think, are now suddenly up in the air. And I think for America, that for many years never believed that it could become an authoritarian state, we see how quickly literally hundreds of years of rituals and of process and of identity can disappear overnight. And we see that in Brazil, and we see that in Israel, and we see that in the Philippines, and we see it all over the world. The natural state of the world is not liberal. The natural state of the world is authoritarian with huge gaps of income inequality. And that's what the world pulls to if there's no counterforce. And if we do believe that humans are equal and things like that, we do need to try to figure out a new way of organizing our society. So we definitely have a lot of challenges, going forward, which are interesting. And I think that private companies and technology have a huge part in it on both sides, on the positive and the negative. Technology is neutral. It's what you do with technology that gives it an opinion on either side of any debate.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of us that set out to do something, important and special and successful. I'm not sure most of us can claim that we've come close to what Waze has done. And I think you said it perfectly earlier, it is a brand that, people live with and meaningfully affects their lives. And, I give you and your team so much credit for the work that you have done, but that you continue to do. It's something that here in Los Angeles, where there's lots of traffic, makes my life a whole lot better and can get me home to my children for dinner and bedtime. And so I thank you for that. I also thank you because I checked in with Noam before the interview. I said, hey, what don't you want to talk about? He said nothing. If there's a question, I'll just say no. And you didn't say no to anything. Some mistakes. We made a mistake on our side. We had some technical issues. And so the first 7 minutes of this, we had to do over again. And so,
it worked out somehow. I just want to say that, yes, my team was crucial in building Waze, but our community really is the essence. And every person who drives with Waze and reports an accident or a crash or something on the road, every person who edits the map, every person who contributes, in that way, are really what makes Waze unique. And we see ourselves as a team as kind of shepherds of this. We have to build kind of a platform to allow people to do what they're going to do. But definitely our community is what really built Waze and what makes it very unique today.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see that community thrive and for all the continued progress you're going to make on the carpooling side. If you can take Los Angeles here and you can start to help transform it, you're going to have a whole lot of people that are going to be absolutely loyal and appreciative. And we're so appreciative and thankful for your time today and all the wisdom shared and lessons learned. We're going to be doing this series on a weekly basis on Entrepreneur. And I really kind of think of somebody, more transparent and straightforward and awesome to have as our kickoff guest. So thank you so much for your time today, Noam, and wishing you lots of continued success and happiness over the next 10 years and beyond.
Thank you for having me. And, everyone have to put on a mask and stay safe.
Yeah. Stay safe, everybody. All right. Thank you.
Bye.